A young
Oh,
waitress
perfect
froze
timing.
as her
Of
uniform
course.
was
Who else
torn
needs
at
a
the
refill?
shoulder.
Thank you so
Laughter
much.
erupted
My
from a
pleasure.
table
Enjoy.
of wealthy boys.
How could you
Phones
do this
lifted,
to me?
recording
I
her
didn't mean
shame.
for this to happen.
Coffee
You
went
always
cold.
say that!
Please,
Forks
stop.
stopped midair. The diner chose silence. Everyone, except one man. In a corner booth, a stranger in worn navy camouflage slowly set down his cup.
I can't
At his
do
feet,
this anymore.
a German shepherd
It's
rose.
okay. I'm here.
A low growl,
Why is this
steady
happening?
and controlled. The room felt it.
This is it.
The
The
laughter
proof.
died.
Are you sure it's authentic?
That was the moment
Look at the
everything
details.
changed.
It looks real.
Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Cold rain pressed against the diner windows, turning the neon sign outside into a trembling smear of red and blue. Inside, the air smelled of old frying oil and burned coffee, the kind of place where time didn't move forward, so much as it wore itself thin. The man sat alone at a wall table, back straight out of habit, shoulders broad beneath a frayed canvas jacket. He looked about 35, tall and solid without trying to be, with a square jaw shadowed by a short, uneven beard. His hair, dark brown and clipped too close to be fashionable, suggested a life where mirrors were optional. His eyes stayed calm, watchful, eyes that had learned long ago to read rooms before rooms read him. In front of him was the cheapest meal on the menu. Beneath the table lay his German shepherd, a large black and tan male, about 6 years old, chest wide, ears alert, body perfectly still, except for the slow rise of breathing. The dog's name was Cooper, and he had learned silence the hard way. The man, Nathan Brooks, had not planned to stop here. He rarely planned anything anymore. Planning required believing tomorrow would be different, and that was a habit he had lost after the service ended. He lived out of a dented pickup behind a row of warehouses, doing day labor when his back allowed it. Cooper was the one constant, rescued from a shelter that labeled him too intense, trained once for work, then discarded after a leg injury that never healed cleanly. Nathan loved him with the quiet devotion of someone who had already lost everything else worth naming. At the center of the diner, laughter rose too loud, too sharp. 4 young men occupied the biggest booth, expensive jackets draped carelessly over the seats, watches catching the light. Their confidence came from money and the certainty that consequences belonged to other people. They talked over one another, voices slick with amusement. A young waitress approached their table. Her name tag read Sarah. She was in her early 20s, tall but slight, with narrow shoulders that made her uniform look a size too big. Her light brown hair was pulled into a low ponytail, already loosening from a long shift. Pale skin showed faint freckles along her arms, and there was a tired kindness in her face, the kind that comes from learning to apologize, even when you've done nothing wrong. "Here you go," Sarah said softly, setting down plates. She kept her eyes lowered, a reflex born from too many nights like this. One of the men leaned back, blocking her path with his knee. Another made a crude joke, his friends laughing as if on cue. Sarah tried to step around them, murmuring an apology she didn't owe. A hand reached out, fingers brushing her sleeve, then gripping. "Hey, don't rush off," the man said, smiling. Nathan felt Cooper's body tense beneath the table. The dog's ears tilted forward, amber eyes fixed on the booth. Nathan's fingers tightened around his mug, the ceramic warm against his palm. The jokes grew sharper. A chair scraped. Then came the sound that cut through the diner, the harsh rip of fabric. Sarah froze. Her uniform had torn at the shoulder, the seam split wide. She clutched the cloth instinctively, cheeks flushing, eyes glassy with shock. Laughter erupted from the booth, loud and careless. No one stood up. The cook stayed in the kitchen. The cashier stared at the register as if numbers might save her. A couple in the corner lowered their heads. Silence settled, heavy and practiced. Nathan's mind slipped somewhere it hadn't gone in years. He remembered other rooms, other laughter, the way cruelty often announced itself with confidence. He had promised himself never again, never intervene. Never step into someone else's chaos. Promises were easier to keep when you were alone. Cooper let out a low, restrained growl. Not a threat, more a warning. Nathan placed his hand on the dog's head, feeling the familiar scar beneath the fur, the one left by a shattered beam years ago. Cooper trusted him. That trust weighed more than fear. At the booth, one of the men stood, towering over Sarah now. "Relax," he said, mockingly gentle. "We're just having fun." Sarah's hands shook as she tried to cover herself. Her breath came in short pulls. She looked around the diner, searching for help, for a sign that someone would see her as a person and not an inconvenience. Nathan set his coffee down. The sound was small, but it carried. His chair slid back as he rose, unfolding to his full height. The jacket hung loose on him, boots scuffed, posture unmistakably steady. Cooper stood as well, stepping out from beneath the table, massive and controlled, every muscle aligned toward the threat without lunging. Nathan took one step forward. The laughter faltered. One of the men turned, eyes narrowing as he took in Nathan's worn clothes, the dog at his side. A smirk crept across his face. "Mind your business," he said. "This doesn't concern you." Nathan didn't answer right away. He looked at Sarah. Really looked, saw the fear she was trying to swallow, the dignity she was struggling to keep intact. Then he met the man's gaze, calm as still water before a storm. Behind him, Cooper stood silent, eyes locked on the booth, tail low, presence unmistakable. Rain hammered harder against the windows. Nathan took another step forward, and the diner held its breath. The room did not erupt when Nathan stepped forward. It shrank. That was the first thing Sarah noticed afterward. Not shouting, not fists, but the way the diner suddenly felt smaller, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. Nathan placed himself between her and the booth with no dramatic movement, no raised voice. He did not touch any of them. He simply stood there, tall and immovable, his body angled just enough to shield her. Cooper remained at his side, massive and silent, head level with the edge of the table, eyes steady and unblinking. For a moment, the young men seemed confused. They were used to noise, arguments, pleading, threats. Silence was unfamiliar territory. One of them laughed, sharp and forced. He was clean-cut, blonde hair styled with expensive care, jaw smooth and pale, the kind of face that had never learned to flinch. "You lost, old man," he said. "Sit back down before your dog does something stupid." Nathan's face did not change. Years earlier, in places far from this diner, he had learned the difference between restraint and fear. This was restraint. He spoke quietly, his voice low and even. "She's done here. You'll let her pass." The blond man's smile faltered. Another of the group stood up, broader, red-faced, irritation etched deep into his brow. He smelled of cologne and whiskey. "You don't tell us what to do," he snapped. "You hear me? You're nobody." Nobody. The word landed harder than a shove. Sarah felt it too. It was the word people used when they wanted you to disappear politely. Cooper shifted his weight, claws clicking softly against the tile. A low sound rose in his chest, not a growl, but a warning held carefully in check. Nathan rested 2 fingers against the dog's collar, a subtle signal. Cooper froze again, disciplined even in anger. That was when the manager finally appeared. His name was Tom Keller, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and a permanently hunched posture, as if he spent his life apologizing to gravity. He wore a grease-stained apron and kept his hands clasped tightly in front of him. His eyes flicked from the young men to Nathan, then quickly away. "Hey," Tom said, voice thin. "Let's not make a scene." Sarah turned toward him, hope flickering. "Sir, they—" Tom cut her off with a sharp look. "Go in the back," he said. Not to the men, to her. "Now." The blond man grinned, victorious. Nathan felt something inside him harden. Not rage, resolve. She didn't do anything wrong. Tom swallowed. I said go. Sarah hesitated, then obeyed, shoulders slumped, one hand still clutching her torn uniform. She did not look at Nathan again, afraid that if she did, she might cry. The police arrived within minutes. 2 officers stepped in, rainwater still clinging to their jackets. The taller one, Officer Dale Henson, was in his early 40s. Thick neck, buzzed hair, a permanent scowl carved into his face. His partner, younger and thinner, stayed half a step behind, eyes darting, uncomfortable. What's going on? Henson asked, already sounding bored. The young men spoke first. They always did. Their version was smooth and confident. An aggressive dog, a drunk vagrant, a disturbance. Henson nodded along, barely glancing at Sarah when she tried to explain, her voice trembling but steady. Henson turned to Nathan at last, eyes sweeping over his worn clothes, his beard, the dog. You causing trouble? He asked. No, Nathan said. I was stopping it. Henson snorted. Looks like you started it. He gestured toward Cooper. That animal dangerous? Cooper stood motionless, ears forward, mouth closed, a model of control. He didn't touch anyone, Sarah said quickly. Neither did he. Henson ignored her. You can't bring a dog like that into a public place, he said. Especially when it's acting aggressive. Nathan felt the familiar ache behind his eyes. He had learned long ago how these conversations ended. He didn't act at all, he said. He stood still. That's not what I'm hearing. Henson's tone sharpened. Here's what's going to happen. You're leaving, and you're taking the dog with you. If I see either of you around here again causing problems, animal control gets involved. Understand? And her? Nathan asked, nodding toward the back room where Sarah had disappeared. Tom spoke up quickly. She's done for the night, he said. We'll handle it. Nathan knew what that meant. Outside, rain soaked through his jacket as he walked Cooper back to the pickup. The diner door closed behind them, sealing the warmth and the noise inside as if nothing had happened at all. Cooper limped slightly now, favoring his back leg. Nathan crouched beside him, hands gentle as he checked the dog's ribs. His jaw tightened when Cooper flinched. I'm sorry, Nathan murmured. The words were not just for the dog. Later that night, long after the diner lights dimmed, Nathan sat in the cab of his truck, engine off, listening to the rain drum against the roof. Cooper lay curled on the passenger seat, eyes half-lidded but alert, pain etched into the lines of his face. Nathan stared out at the darkness. He had survived firefights, explosions, ambushes. He had been trained to act, to intervene, to protect. Yet here, in a quiet town with clean sidewalks and polite smiles, he felt more powerless than he ever had overseas. The next morning, Sarah stood in the manager's office, hands folded, shoulders squared. In daylight, she looked even younger. Her hair was still damp from the rain, loose strands clinging to her cheeks. Tom avoided her gaze. I'm letting you go, he said. Last night crossed a line. I didn't do anything, Sarah replied. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. They assaulted me. Tom sighed. I can't afford trouble. You understand. She nodded slowly. She had learned, as most women in her position did, that understanding was often demanded, never offered. By noon, her locker was empty. By evening, a notice was taped to her apartment door, eviction pending, property scheduled for redevelopment. Sarah sank down against the wall, paper trembling in her hand. The world felt very quiet again. Across the neighborhood, Nathan watched as she walked out carrying a single bag, her shoulders drawn tight against the cold. He did not approach. He knew the weight of pride, the need not to be pitied. Instead, he opened the tailgate of his truck and quietly left a folded blanket and a bag of groceries by her door. From his cab, Cooper watched her notice them. She looked around, confused, then slowly sat down, pressing the blanket to her chest. For a brief moment, her eyes lifted toward Nathan's truck. He met her gaze, nodded once, and then drove away. The town settled back into its routine. The men from the diner returned the following night, laughing louder than before. The police drove by, unhurried, and in the space left behind by Sarah's absence, something invisible but heavy began to grow. Nathan lay awake that night, Cooper's breathing steady beside him. He thought of promises made to himself, of lines drawn and erased. He thought of how easy it was to leave, how tempting. Outside, rain clouds gathered again. Morning came quietly, without apology. The rain had washed the streets clean, leaving behind cracked sidewalks that glistened as if pretending to be new. The neighborhood woke the way it always did, slowly, cautiously, like an animal used to being startled. Doors opened just enough to look outside. Curtains shifted. People checked whether the world had changed overnight. It had not. But something had begun to loosen. Nathan Brooks parked his dented pickup near the edge of the block and cut the engine. He sat for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to Cooper breathe beside him. In daylight, the dog's injury was more visible. The German Shepherd was large, powerfully built through the chest and shoulders, his black and tan coat thick but dulled in places by age and old scars. One hind leg still didn't bend the way it should, forcing him into a careful, uneven gait. Yet his eyes remained clear and alert, amber and intelligent, following every movement outside the windshield. Cooper was not a young dog anymore, but he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had once known purpose and still remembered it. Nathan stepped out, stretching his back slowly. His face, with its sharp angles and weathered calm, showed little expression, but the lines around his eyes spoke of long nights and shorter hopes. He did not wear a watch. Time had stopped mattering to him in neat measurements. What mattered now was who needed help today. He started with Mrs. Alvarez, 3 houses down. She was in her late 70s, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair pinned carefully into a bun each morning, as if dignity itself were something that could unravel. Her husband had died years ago, and the roof had begun to leak soon after, a slow betrayal she could not afford to fix. Nathan climbed the ladder without being asked. He patched the shingles with materials scavenged from a job site, hands moving with methodical patience. Mrs. Alvarez brought him coffee in a chipped mug and watched Cooper sit guard at the bottom of the ladder, head lifted, ears scanning the street. She had once been afraid of big dogs. Now she found comfort in the way Cooper never took his eyes off the house. By noon, Nathan had driven a man with a bad hip to a free clinic across town. The man's name was Paul, early 60s, once broad-shouldered and strong, now stooped by years of factory work that ended with a layoff and a handshake. Paul talked too much in the truck, nervous words spilling out, apologizing for the smell of his jacket, for taking up space. Nathan listened without interruption. Cooper lay across the back seat, steady and warm, a presence that seemed to quiet the man's voice more effectively than reassurance. Word spread the way it always does in places like this, not through announcements, but through noticing. A porch fixed, a ride given, a bag of groceries left where a door would open onto it. Nathan never stayed long. He did not want thanks. He did not want to be known. Being known had once cost him too much. Sarah noticed anyway. She had moved what little she owned into a single duffel bag and was sleeping on the couch of a woman she barely knew, a former co-worker from the diner who had 2 kids and a kindness that came with limits. In the mornings, Sarah walked the neighborhood with no real destination, her long strides carrying her past houses that now bore fresh red markings near the doors. She was still tall and slender, her posture straighter than she felt, her light brown hair now worn loose because she had no uniform to pin it back for. In daylight, the bruising fear of that night in the diner had settled into something quieter and heavier. She felt erased. She saw Cooper first, lying in the shade of a maple tree outside an old duplex. The dog's size startled her, but his stillness drew her closer. When she noticed Nathan kneeling beside a broken step, hammer in hand, something tightened in her chest. "You don't have to do that," she said, standing a few feet away. Her voice was softer than she intended. Nathan looked up. For a moment he seemed unsure whether to speak. Then he nodded. "Someone does." Sarah watched his hands, the care with which he aligned the wood, the absence of hurry. "You shouldn't get involved," she added, though she did not know why she said it. Nathan wiped his hands on his jeans. "I already am." She smiled faintly, then looked away, embarrassed by how much that answer meant to her. Cooper rose slowly, tail low but wagging once, deliberate. Sarah crouched without thinking, letting the dog sniff her hand. His nose was warm, his breath steady. She laughed, a short, surprised sound she had not made in days. As the afternoon wore on, more people noticed Cooper. Children approached carefully, their parents watching from doorways, tense until they saw how gently he lowered his head, how patiently he endured curious fingers. An elderly man, whose wife no longer recognized him, sat on his porch steps, while Cooper lay beside his feet, unmoving, as if assigned to the task of keeping memories intact. Nathan did not speak about the diner. Neither did anyone else. But stories began to surface anyway, whispered, and then repeated. Someone remembered how Nathan had once stayed through the night when a woman's power went out in winter, sitting in his truck so she wouldn't be alone. Someone else recalled seeing Cooper outside a house for hours, refusing to leave until an ambulance arrived. None of these moments had felt important at the time. Now, they gathered weight. By evening, Sarah returned to the building where she had lived, hoping to retrieve a box she had left behind. The door was locked. A notice had been stapled beside it, crisp and official, announcing redevelopment timelines and warnings against trespassing. She stood there longer than she should have, staring at words that reduced her life to a line item. Nathan did not come closer. He parked across the street, engine off, Cooper watching from the open window. When Sarah finally turned away, shoulders shaking, she found a paper bag on the curb where she had not seen it before. Inside were canned goods, bread, a folded note with no signature. Just one sentence. "You are not invisible." That night, meetings began to happen by accident. 2 neighbors talked while waiting for a bus. 3 more joined them later, standing in the cooling air. Complaints were shared tentatively at first. Rent increases, sudden notices, repairs denied. A woman mentioned her brother, a construction worker who had died on a site years ago. The cause listed as negligence. The company dissolved soon after. Another man spoke of being pressured to sign documents he did not understand. No one raised their voice. They were afraid of that. But they listened. Nathan passed through these small gatherings without staying, Cooper always beside him, the dog's limp more pronounced now as the day caught up to him. People noticed that too. Strength that endures pain without complaint has a way of earning trust. Late that night, Nathan sat on the tailgate of his truck, sharing the last of his dinner with Cooper. The dog ate slowly, then rested his head against Nathan's knee, eyes closing. Nathan stared at the streetlights flickering on, one by one. He thought of leaving. He thought of how easy it would be to drive until this place disappeared in the rearview mirror. He also thought of Sarah's laugh that afternoon, brief and fragile. He stayed. Across the block, lights went out in a house that had been occupied for decades. The silence that followed felt deliberate, rehearsed. Somewhere far off, engines revved, voices laughed. Nathan did not look away. Cooper lifted his head again, ears forward, sensing what his human already knew. The neighborhood was changing, not loudly, not all at once. But something that had been buried was beginning to surface. The rain began just after midnight, light at first, almost polite, the kind that fooled people into believing the night would pass quietly. Low clouds pressed down on the neighborhood, trapping the smell of damp wood and old brick. Somewhere beneath that calm, gasoline had already been poured. Nathan Brooks woke before the sirens, before the shouts. Years ago, in another life, his body had learned the language of danger before his mind could name it. He sat up in the cab of his truck, heart steady, breath controlled. Cooper was already awake. The German Shepherd stood rigid between the seats, ears high, nose lifted, drawing in the air with sudden urgency. His low whine was not fear. It was warning. The first flame appeared at the far end of the block, licking up the side of an abandoned unit that everyone knew was scheduled for demolition. The second followed too quickly to be coincidence. Windows shattered with sharp cracks, sparks leaping like startled birds. Then the wind shifted, and the fire took hold. Someone screamed. Nathan was out of the truck before he finished putting on his jacket. He ran toward the sound, boots slapping wet pavement, smoke already stinging his eyes. The old complex groaned as fire spread through dry beams and neglected wiring, heat rolling outward in waves that bent the air. People stumbled out half-dressed, coughing, dragging children by the arms. Some froze in the street, staring as if the flames were a judgment they did not know how to answer. "Everyone out!" Nathan shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos, calm but unyielding. Authority had not left him with his uniform. It had only gone quiet. He pushed through the front entrance of the nearest building, wrapping his jacket around his forearm as he shielded his face. Inside, smoke choked the hallways, turning distance into guesswork. He followed the sound of coughing, found a man collapsed near the stairwell, his face gray, eyes wide with panic. Nathan lifted him without ceremony, ignoring the searing pain in his arms as he carried the man back into the rain. Cooper did not follow at first. The dog stood at the edge of the doorway, torn between instinct and injury, his bad leg trembling as he shifted his weight. Nathan met his eyes for a fraction of a second. "Stay close," he said, not loudly. Cooper barked once, sharp and decisive, and went in. Together, they moved deeper. Cooper's nose worked relentlessly, guiding them toward doors where movement still stirred behind smoke-darkened glass. He scratched, barked, circled back when Nathan faltered, his presence a living compass. In one apartment, they found a young mother crouched in a bathroom, clutching her toddler, frozen with terror. Her hair was dark and tangled, her face streaked with soot and tears. Nathan wrapped the child in his jacket, pressed the woman forward with steady hands, repeating the same words until she moved. "You're not alone. Keep going." Outside, neighbors gathered in the rain, some barefoot, some bleeding, all watching the buildings burn. Sarah stood among them, a borrowed sweater clutched around her thin frame. Her light brown hair hung loose and damp, her pale skin reflecting the orange glow of the fire. She searched the doorway with frantic eyes, fear tightening her chest with every second that passed. Then she saw Cooper. The dog emerged, dragging an older man by the sleeve of his coat, his injured leg buckling under the effort. The man collapsed onto the wet pavement, alive. Sarah rushed forward without thinking, dropping to her knees beside Cooper, her hands hovering uselessly as she realized the dog was hurt. A beam had come down, hard across his back, leaving a deep gash beneath the fur. Blood darkened his coat, mixing with rainwater, but his eyes were still clear, fixed on the doorway. "He went back in," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. As if summoned by her words, Nathan stumbled out moments later, carrying a woman whose breathing rattled in her chest. His face was blistered, his eyebrows singed, smoke embedded in every line of his skin. He did not stop moving until the woman was laid gently on the ground, her breathing easing as paramedics rushed forward. Only then did he turn toward Cooper. The world seemed to narrow to that moment. Nathan dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain in his own body, hands shaking as he pressed against the wound, his voice low and urgent. "Hey, boy. Stay with me. You hear me?" Cooper's tail thumped once, weak but deliberate, as if to answer. Fire crews arrived in force, hoses cutting arcs through the night, steam rising where water met flame. The buildings burned down to their bones, but no one else was inside. When the last person was accounted for, the street fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the crackle of dying embers. As dawn approached, people did not go back to sleep. They gathered in small clusters, wrapped in blankets, sharing what little warmth they had. Someone brought coffee. Someone else handed out dry clothes. No one spoke of accidents. No one spoke of bad luck. They spoke of patterns. A man named Harold, late 50s, heavyset with a thick gray beard and hands scarred from years of electrical work, stood apart at first. He had always kept his head down, signed what he was told to sign, told his family it was safer that way. Now he stepped forward, his voice rough but steady. He talked about a night years ago when a fire inspector had been paid to look the other way. A woman joined him, describing how her brother's death on a construction site had been ruled unavoidable, the company gone by morning. Another followed, then another, their stories overlapping, forming something undeniable. Nathan listened from the back of the crowd, Cooper lying beside him on a stretcher, sedated but breathing. He did not interrupt. He did not lead. When the voices slowed, when the fear threatened to reclaim the space it had held for so long, he spoke only once. "If you've ever been told to stay quiet to survive," he said, his voice hoarse but carrying, "then don't let tonight end with just ashes. Don't leave one person standing alone." The words did not feel like a speech. They felt like permission. Sarah was the first to step forward. Her hands shook as she spoke, but she did not look away. She talked about the diner, about the torn uniform, about being erased with paperwork and silence. Others followed. Pens were found. Paper appeared from pockets, from cars, from a volunteer's clipboard. Names were written carefully, deliberately. Not one letter at a time, but together, shoulder to shoulder, as if proximity itself offered protection. By mid-morning, dozens of signatures covered the pages. They were not addressed locally. They were sent higher, beyond familiar offices and familiar threats. Copies were made, photographs taken, evidence preserved. As ambulances pulled away and investigators arrived, the neighborhood did not scatter. They stood where they were, soaked and exhausted and awake in a way they hadn't been before. The fire had taken buildings. It hadn't taken them. Nathan watched as Cooper was loaded into the back of a veterinary transport van, Sarah's hand resting briefly on his shoulder in quiet gratitude. He felt the weight of the night settle into his bones. He also felt something else, something fragile and dangerous, like hope. Behind them, smoke drifted upward, thinning into the pale morning sky. What remained was not destruction alone, but the unmistakable outline of a community that had chosen, at last, to stand. The days after the fire did not feel triumphant. They felt slow, tender, and uncertain, like a body learning how to move again after injury. Smoke lingered in the air long after the last ember had died, clinging to clothes and hair, settling into the seams of the street. Investigators came and went. Tape went up. Clipboards appeared. But what changed first was quieter than any official action. Nathan Brooks spent those first days moving between the veterinary clinic and the neighborhood, his steps measured, his shoulders stiff with healing burns. He slept little, mostly in the cab of his truck, waking at odd hours with the same reflexive alertness that had followed him home from another life. Without Cooper beside him, the nights felt louder. The absence was not empty. It was heavy. Cooper survived surgery. The veterinarian, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Ellen Price, with iron-gray hair cut short and hands that moved with practiced gentleness, explained the damage plainly. The beam had missed his spine by inches. The gash would scar. His injured leg would never be perfect. But his heart was strong, she said, and his will stronger. When Nathan finally saw him, wrapped in bandages, eyes half-lidded but unmistakably present, something in his chest loosened for the first time since the fire. Cooper's tail moved once, then again, a small, stubborn rhythm. It was enough. Back on the block, the neighborhood gathered without being asked. People brought food to one another. Someone organized rides. A retired schoolteacher named Louise, short and round with carefully curled white hair and a voice that carried warmth even when she scolded, began keeping a list of names and phone numbers on a yellow legal pad. "So we don't disappear again," she said. No one argued. The petitions they had signed were not forgotten. Copies went to state offices. Emails followed. Photographs of the fire scene circulated alongside witness statements and old documents that had been saved for years in drawers and boxes, waiting for the courage to be useful. The response was not immediate, but it was real. Officials from outside the county arrived, their unfamiliar badges and careful questions changing the shape of conversations. The redevelopment project was paused. Permits were reviewed. A criminal investigation into the fire was opened, its language precise and unmistakable. Sarah watched these developments from the edge of the room more often than the center. She had returned to the diner building in daylight, stepping carefully across a floor that still smelled faintly of grease and disinfectant. The torn uniform had been replaced by borrowed clothes, but the memory of that night stayed close to her skin. She was still tall and slender, her movements economical, her light brown hair now cut a little shorter, as if shedding weight she no longer needed. The fear that once folded her inward had not vanished, but it had changed. It no longer asked her to shrink. With help from neighbors, she cleaned. Someone fixed the broken hinge on the back door. Another patched a crack in the wall. A small loan came through a local credit union after the city announced a temporary freeze on evictions tied to the investigation. The sign went back up in the window. Not new, not glossy, but familiar. When the diner reopened, there were no balloons, just coffee, and the steady hum of a place returning to itself. Nathan did not take a seat the first night. He stood by the door, hands in his jacket pockets, watching Sarah move behind the counter with a quiet competence that came from doing something often enough to know where your strength lived. When she looked up and caught his eye, she smiled, small, unforced. He nodded. That was enough. Cooper came home a week later. He walked slowly, the scar along his back a stark reminder of what had been paid. Children noticed first. They approached with reverence, not grabbing, not shouting, their parents watching with softened eyes. Cooper accepted the attention with dignity, settling near the diner entrance each evening, a living threshold. He did not bark. He watched. People found themselves sitting a little straighter when they passed him, as if remembering something they had nearly forgotten. The official announcements arrived in stages. Charges were filed related to the fire. Safety violations long ignored were acknowledged. The redevelopment project was formally suspended pending review. It was not justice wrapped in celebration. It was justice rendered in careful steps. For the neighborhood, it was enough to begin. Nathan was offered work, steady, unglamorous, necessary. He took it without ceremony, fixing things that had been broken for a long time. He still slept in his truck some nights, still counted his money carefully, still shared his meals. But there was a stool with his name scratched into the wood at the diner now, and coffee waiting, whether he arrived early or late. On a quiet afternoon, Sarah sat across from him, sunlight catching the faint freckles on her pale skin. "You could leave," she said, not accusing, just honest. Nathan considered the question, his gaze resting on Cooper, who lay nearby with his chin on his paws, eyes following the slow arc of dust in the light. "I know," he said. Then, after a moment, "I'm not going to." The neighborhood did not call him a hero. They did not need to. They knew what he was because they had learned what they could be together. When new people moved in, they were told the story not as a legend, but as a lesson. This place did not stay quiet anymore. At dusk, when the streetlights came on, Cooper took his usual place by the diner door. The scar on his back caught the light, a line that would never fade. Inside, voices rose and fell, ordinary and alive. Outside, Nathan leaned against the wall, breathing in the evening, feeling the weight of the days settle into something like peace. The world had not been changed by a single act. It had been changed by standing long enough for others to stand too. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they arrive as a quiet man who refuses to look away, a wounded dog who refuses to quit, and a community that finally finds the courage to stand together. Scripture tells us that faith can move mountains, but often God moves through ordinary people who choose compassion over fear. If this story touched your heart, let it be a reminder. No act of kindness is ever wasted. No voice raised for justice is ever unheard. May God bless you and your loved ones, protect the vulnerable in your life, and give you the courage to stand when silence feels safer. If this message spoke to you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment with where you're watching from, and subscribe so we can keep telling stories that restore faith, faith in people, and faith in God.